The envelope was thick, cream-colored, and sat on my kitchen counter like a coiled snake. I knew what it was before I even opened it. The HOA seal pressed into the wax told me everything. Kate Sullivan, our association president, had made good on her threat. I tore it open slowly, deliberately, the way you'd peel back a bandage from an old wound. The letter inside was 3 pages long, typed in that official font they use to make bureaucracy feel like law. Notice of violation and mandatory compliance, it said at the top. Below that, in bold letters that seemed to scream off the page, your solar panel installation is in direct violation of Section 7.4b of the Community Aesthetic Standards. You have 30 days to remove the installation or face fines of $500 per day, compounding weekly. $500 per day. I set the letter down and looked out my kitchen window at the 8 solar panels mounted on my south-facing roof. They'd been up there for 6 months now, quietly converting sunlight into electricity, saving me nearly $200 a month on my power bill. They were clean, efficient, and aligned perfectly with the roof pitch. You'd barely notice them unless you were looking for something to complain about. Kate had been looking. The panels weren't an eyesore. They weren't hurting anyone. But Kate Sullivan didn't see them as practical technology. She saw them as defiance, as a crack in the perfect suburban facade she'd spent the last 8 years building in our little planned community here in Mesa, Arizona. To her, those panels were a statement that I didn't care about her vision of uniform rooflines and matching mailboxes. She was right about one thing. I didn't. I'm 68 years old. I spent 32 years as a civil engineer for the Army Corps, most of that time designing power infrastructure in places where the grid was either non-existent or barely functional. I've seen what happens when the lights go out and don't come back on. I've watched entire communities crumble because they put their faith in systems that failed them when it mattered most. So when I retired and moved to this quiet subdivision outside Phoenix, I made a promise to myself. I would never be dependent on a system I couldn't control. The solar panels were just the beginning. I had a rainwater collection system hidden in my backyard, a small greenhouse for vegetables, and enough canned goods in my pantry to last 3 months. I wasn't a doomsday prepper screaming about the end times. I was just a man who understood that resilience isn't paranoia. It's common sense. But common sense doesn't win arguments with people like Kate Sullivan. I folded the letter and slid it back into the envelope. My hands were steady, but I could feel the anger building in my chest, hot and tight. Not rage, just disappointment. Disappointment that in a world growing more unpredictable by the day, the thing people chose to fight about was how a neighbor's roof looked. I'd tried to talk to Kate before the letter came. 2 weeks ago I'd gone to her house, a pristine 2-story colonial with white shutters and a lawn so green it looked plastic. She'd answered the door in yoga pants and a blazer, the uniform of suburban authority. "Steve," she'd said, not smiling. "I was wondering when you'd show up. I got your email," I'd replied, "about the panels. Then you know what needs to happen." "Kate, these panels aren't hurting anyone. They're actually helping. My energy bills dropped by half." She'd crossed her arms, her face tightening. "That's wonderful for you, Steve, really. But this isn't about your electric bill. This is about the community. We have standards here. Standards that everyone agreed to when they bought their homes." "I read the covenants," I'd said, keeping my voice calm. "There's nothing in there that explicitly bans solar panels. Section 7.4b prohibits any external modifications that negatively impact the visual harmony of the neighborhood." Visual harmony, I'd repeated, tasting the words. "Kate, half the houses on this street have satellite dishes bigger than my panels. Those are discreet. They're bolted to the side of people's houses." Her jaw had set, the way it does when someone's decided they're right, and nothing you say will change it. "The board voted, Steve, 4-1. The panels need to go. And if I appeal, you can appeal, but I wouldn't waste your time. And I'd better make sure to include a call to action soon, after 2-3 minutes of narrative. Let me continue naturally building the tension first. I'd appealed anyway, filed the paperwork, gathered photos showing that the panels blended seamlessly with my roof, even got a letter from my installer, explaining how they met all county codes and increased my property value. I'd presented everything at the monthly board meeting, standing in front of 5 people sitting behind a folding table in the community center like it was a tribunal. Kate had sat in the center, flanked by 2 retirees who nodded at everything she said, and 2 younger members who looked uncomfortable but said nothing. I'd made my case for 15 minutes. talked about energy independence, climate resilience, the rising cost of utilities. I'd kept it practical, not preachy. When I finished, Kate had smiled that thin smile people use when they've already made up their mind. "Thank you, Steve," she'd said. "We'll take it under advisement." 3 days later, I got the denial letter. No explanation, just a single sentence. "Your appeal has been reviewed and rejected by a unanimous vote of the board." Unanimous. That's when I knew this wasn't about aesthetics or property values. This was about control. About making sure everyone understood that Kate Sullivan decided what was acceptable in this community, and deviation wasn't tolerated. So here I was, staring at a letter threatening me with financial ruin unless I dismantled the one piece of infrastructure that gave me genuine security. I won't lie to you. Part of me wanted to rip those panels down just to avoid the fight. Life's too short for petty wars with people who think power comes from a gavel and a rule book. But another part of me, the part that had spent decades watching systems fail and people suffer, knew that giving in would be worse than any fine Kate could levy, because this wasn't really about solar panels. It was about whether we'd become so obsessed with appearances that we'd sacrifice actual preparedness for the illusion of perfection. If you've ever felt like you were the only sane person in a world that's lost its mind, or if you've ever been punished for doing something smart just because it made someone uncomfortable, then you understand exactly where I was standing that morning. And if this story resonates with you, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and like this video. It helps us share these real experiences with more people who need to hear them. Now let me tell you what happened next, because what came after that letter changed everything. I decided not to take the panels down. Instead, I sent Kate a certified letter explaining that I would not be in compliance by the 30-day deadline and that I looked forward to her legal action so we could let a judge decide whether her interpretation of visual harmony outweighed my right to energy independence. It was polite, professional, and it made my position crystal clear. The fines started on day 31. $500 appeared on my HOA statement, then another $500 the next day. By the end of the first week, I was looking at $3,500 in penalties, and Kate had sent another letter informing me that the association was prepared to place a lien on my property if the balance reached $10,000. I paid my regular HOA dues. I ignored the fines. The neighbors started talking. Some of them supported me quietly, stopping by to tell me they thought the whole thing was ridiculous. Others avoided eye contact when I walked past, like non-compliance was contagious. A few openly sided with Kate, agreeing loudly at community meetings that rules were rules and that letting one person break them would lead to chaos. Margaret Chen, who lived 2 doors down, came by one afternoon with a casserole and a worried expression. Margaret was 73, a retired teacher with silver hair always pulled back in a bun and a voice that still carried the authority of someone who'd spent 40 years managing classrooms. "Steve," she'd said, setting the dish on my counter, "you need to be careful. Kate's not going to back down. She'll take your house if she has to." "She can try," I'd replied. "But I don't think a judge is going to side with an HOA that wants to prevent energy efficiency." "It's not about the judge. It's about the fight. Do you really want to spend the next year in court over this?" I'd looked at Margaret then, really looked at her. She was scared, not for herself, but for me. She'd lived through enough to know that fighting authority, even petty suburban authority, came with costs. "Margaret," I'd said gently, "what happens when the power goes out?" She'd blinked. "What?" "When the grid fails, when there's a storm or an equipment failure or something bigger. What happens to you? To everyone on this street? We wait for it to come back on. And if it doesn't?" She hadn't answered, just stood there, hands folded, looking at me like I was talking about some distant hypothetical instead of a reality I'd seen play out dozens of times across 3 decades of infrastructure work. "I'm not trying to be difficult," I'd continued. "I'm trying to be ready. And those panels up there, they're the difference between having light and having darkness when everything else fails." Margaret had nodded slowly, but I could tell she didn't really understand. Not yet. None of them did. By mid-August, the fines had climbed past $8,000. Kate sent another letter, this one threatening legal action within 10 days. I consulted with a lawyer, a sharp woman named Rachel Tobias, who specialized in property law. She'd reviewed my case and told me I had a decent chance of winning, but that it would take time and money. "HOAs lose these fights more often than they win," she'd said, "especially when it comes to solar panels. But Kate Sullivan strikes me as the type who'll drag this out just to make a point. Let her, I'd said. Rachel had given me a look that said she'd heard that kind of bravado before, usually right before her client started panicking about legal fees. But I meant it, because I knew something Kate didn't. I knew that systems fail. I knew that the comfortable, predictable world she was trying to preserve with her covenants and her fines was far more fragile than she wanted to believe. I just didn't know how soon I'd be proven right. It happened on a Tuesday, September 12th, 3 months after Kate's first letter. I was in my garage organizing supplies when the lights flickered once, twice, then died completely. The sudden silence was startling. No hum from the refrigerator, no distant buzz of air conditioning units, just quiet. I walked outside. The street was still. Other neighbors were stepping out onto their porches, looking around with confused expressions. Someone down the block shouted, "Anyone else lose power?" A chorus of voices confirmed it. The whole neighborhood was dark. I checked my phone. No service. That was unusual. I went back inside and flipped the switch that connected my solar panels to my home system instead of the grid. The lights in my kitchen came on immediately, soft and steady. Through my window, I could see the rest of the street still dark. I turned on my battery-powered radio, the one I kept charged for situations exactly like this. It took a minute to find a station that was broadcasting. When I did, the voice was tense, almost frantic. Reports are still coming in, but what we know is that a coordinated cyber attack has targeted multiple power substations across Arizona, Nevada, and Southern California. Authorities are calling it unprecedented in scale. The electric grid is down across the entire southwest region, affecting an estimated 12 million people. Officials are urging residents to remain calm and stay indoors. There is no timeline for restoration of services at this time. I turned the volume down and sat at my kitchen table, the radio crackling softly in the background. 12 million people. No timeline. This wasn't a blown transformer or a downed line. This was infrastructure collapse, the kind of event I'd spent my whole career preparing for and hoping would never come. I thought about Kate's letter still sitting in my desk drawer. $500 a day for panels that were now the only source of electricity on the entire block. The irony was so sharp it almost made me laugh. Almost. The first 24 hours were quiet, almost peaceful. People stayed in their houses, probably thinking the power would come back any minute. I could see them through windows, lighting candles, digging through drawers for flashlights. A few walked down to the main road to see if anyone knew what was happening. They came back shaking their heads. I spent that first day doing what I'd always planned to do in a situation like this. I checked my water reserves, inventoried my food supply, made sure my solar battery bank was charging properly. My panels were generating power, even as the rest of the neighborhood sat in darkness. I had lights, I had refrigeration. I had the ability to charge my phone and laptop, even though there was no cell service and no internet. I was prepared. But preparation without compassion is just survival, and I'm not the kind of man who watches his neighbors suffer when I have the means to help. On the second day, I started hearing generators. The throaty rumble of gas-powered engines echoed through the subdivision as people fired up their emergency backup systems. I counted maybe 6 or 7 running by mid-morning. That sound, that mechanical coughing and sputtering, was the sound of temporary relief. But I knew what most people didn't. Those generators would run for maybe a week, 2 at most, before the fuel ran out. And in a grid-down scenario like this, gas stations couldn't pump without electricity. The fuel those generators burned was all they were going to get. By day 3, the generators started going quiet. One by one, they sputtered out, their tanks empty, their owners standing in driveways staring at silent machines like they'd been betrayed. That's when the real desperation started to show. I saw Tom Bradshaw from across the street trying to siphon gas from his lawnmower into his generator. His hands shaking so badly, he spilled half of it on his driveway. The Ramirez family, the young couple with twin babies, knocked on doors asking if anyone had formula because their supply was running low and the stores were either closed or cleaned out. Old Mr. Patterson, who lived alone at the end of the block, sat on his porch steps in the heat, fanning himself with a newspaper, his face red and slick with sweat. The temperature outside was pushing 105 degrees. Inside those dark houses, without air conditioning, it was easily 10 degrees hotter. Refrigerators that had been off for 72 hours were starting to smell. Food was spoiling. Medicine that required refrigeration was going bad. And still, no word on when the power would return. I helped where I could without drawing too much attention. I brought Mr. Patterson a battery-powered fan and a gallon of cold water from my fridge. I gave the Ramirez family 3 cans of formula I'd stocked for situations exactly like this. I didn't make a show of it. I just did it. But people noticed. They noticed that my house had lights on at night while theirs stayed dark. They noticed that I wasn't panicking, wasn't scrambling. And slowly, cautiously, some of them started asking questions. "Steve," Tom Bradshaw said one afternoon, walking over while I was checking my solar panel connections, "how are you running power?" I pointed up at the panels. He followed my gaze, squinting against the sun. "Those things work without the grid." "They do if you set them up right," I said. "I've got a battery bank in my garage that stores the excess. Gives me about 3 days of power even without sunlight." Tom stared at those panels like he was seeing them for the first time. "Kate tried to make you take those down." "She did." "Jesus," he muttered. "She must feel like an idiot right now." I didn't respond to that. There was no satisfaction in being right when the cost was this high. By day 5, the neighborhood had descended into something I recognized from my years overseas, that desperate, hollow-eyed exhaustion that comes when people realize the cavalry isn't coming. The radio broadcasts were still talking about progress and restoration efforts, but there were no timelines, no concrete plans, just vague assurances that authorities were working around the clock. People started forming small groups, pooling resources, sharing what little they had. The Hendersons opened their pool so people could cool off and collect water for toilets. The Chens shared their camping stove so families could heat food. There was a kind of raw, improvised community forming, born out of necessity. But there was tension too, arguments over supplies, accusations of hoarding. I saw 2 men nearly come to blows over a bag of ice someone had driven 40 miles to buy from a gas station still running on a backup generator. Fear does ugly things to people, and this neighborhood was getting scared. I kept my head down and my door locked. Not because I didn't care, but because I knew that in situations like this, the person with resources becomes a target. I'd seen it before. Desperation erases decency faster than you'd think. On the evening of day 6, someone knocked on my door. 3 hard, urgent raps that echoed through my quiet house. I looked through the peephole. Kate Sullivan stood on my porch. Her perfect blonde hair, usually styled and sprayed into submission, hung limp and greasy around her face. Her yoga pants were stained. Her blazer was gone, replaced by a wrinkled t-shirt. But it was her eyes that stopped me. They were red, swollen, ringed with dark circles. She looked like she hadn't slept in days. She knocked again, harder this time. I opened the door. "Steve," she said, and her voice cracked on my name. "I need to talk to you." I stepped aside and let her in. The cool air from my house hit her like a wave, and I saw her shoulders sag with relief. She stood in my entryway looking around at my lights, my ceiling fan turning lazily overhead, the soft hum of my refrigerator in the kitchen. "You have power," she whispered. "I do." She turned to face me, and I saw tears sliding down her cheeks. Not the manipulative tears of someone trying to get their way, but the raw, exhausted tears of someone who'd reached the end of themselves. "My mother," she said quietly. "She lives with me. Did you know that?" I shook my head. "She's 84. She has COPD. She needs a nebulizer treatment twice a day to breathe properly. It's electric, battery-powered backups only last so long, and I ran out yesterday." Kate's voice was shaking now, each word coming out with effort. "I've been driving all over the city trying to find a place with power. Every hospital, every urgent care center, they're overrun. They won't even let us in unless it's life or death. And I'm watching my mother struggle to breathe and I can't help her. And I realized," she stopped, swallowing hard, "I realized that the only person in this entire neighborhood who can help us is the man I tried to destroy over a goddamn roof." The silence between us was heavy. "I'm sorry," she said, and those 2 words carried the weight of complete defeat. "I'm so sorry, Steve. You were right about everything. About the panels, about being prepared, about all of it. And I was wrong. I was so wrong." I gestured to my kitchen table. "Sit down." She did, collapsing into the chair like her legs couldn't hold her anymore. I poured her a glass of cold water from my fridge. She drank it in 3 long gulps, then set the glass down with trembling hands. "How much power do you have?" she asked. "Enough," I said. The panels generate about 6 kilowatts during peak sun. My battery bank stores about 15 kilowatt hours. I'm running minimal systems, so I'm actually building a surplus each day. Can you... She hesitated, looking down at her hands. Can you power a nebulizer? Just for an hour a day, I'll pay you whatever you want. I looked at this woman who'd threatened me, fined me, tried to force me to tear down the very thing that was now her only hope. And I could have said no. Could have reminded her of every letter, every fine, every dismissive comment she'd made about my paranoia. Could have told her that she'd made her bed, and now she had to lie in it. But that's not who I am. Bring your mother over, I said. Bring the nebulizer. We'll set it up in my spare room. She can do her treatments here for as long as she needs to. Kate's face crumpled. She put her head in her hands and sobbed, deep shaking sobs that came from somewhere primal, grief and relief and shame all tangled together. Thank you, she managed between breaths. Thank you. Within an hour, Kate returned with her mother, Eleanor, a tiny woman with paper-thin skin and eyes that still held sharp intelligence despite her body's frailty. I set them up in my guest bedroom, plugged in the nebulizer, and left them alone while Eleanor took her treatment. Kate found me in the kitchen afterward. The neighborhood's falling apart, she said quietly. People are scared. Some are talking about leaving, trying to drive somewhere that has power. But the news says the roads are gridlocked, accidents everywhere because the traffic lights are out. Leaving's a bad idea, I said. Right now, the safest thing is to stay put and work together. That's what I told them, but I don't think they trust me anymore. She looked at me with an expression that was part question, part plea. They trust you, Kate? I saw what you've been doing. The formula for the Ramirez family, the fan for Mr. Patterson. You've been taking care of people. Quietly, without making a big deal about it. She took a breath. I think you need to tell them what to do, how to survive this. I didn't want that responsibility. Didn't want to be the leader, the voice of authority. I just wanted to keep my head down and make sure my neighbors didn't die. But sometimes you don't get to choose your role. Sometimes it chooses you. The next morning, I stood in the middle of our street and called an emergency meeting. Word spread quickly, and within 30 minutes, almost every household had someone standing in the growing crowd. 40, maybe 50 people, all looking at me with desperate hope. I kept it simple. Told them we needed to pool resources, establish a water distribution system, set up a community kitchen using camping stoves and grills, organize security patrols at night. I explained that my solar setup could charge phones and power medical devices, but that we needed to prioritize and ration. We don't know how long this will last, I said. Could be days, could be weeks, but we'll get through it if we work together and stay smart. Tom Bradshaw spoke up. What about Kate? She's still president of the HOA. Shouldn't she... I'm resigning, Kate interrupted, stepping forward. Her voice was clear, steady. Effective immediately. I've spent the last year enforcing rules that didn't matter and ignoring the things that did. Steve tried to tell me, tried to show me, and I punished him for it. She turned to look at me. I'm recommending that the board appoint Steve as head of a new emergency preparedness committee, someone who actually knows what they're doing. There was a murmur of agreement through the crowd. I didn't want the title, but I accepted it because it meant I could help more people. Over the next 2 weeks, we transformed. The neighborhood that had once argued over mailbox colors and lawn heights became a functioning, resilient community. My solar panels powered a rotating schedule of nebulizer treatments, insulin refrigeration and phone charging. We collected rainwater for washing. We shared food. We looked after each other. The generators that had run out of gas sat silent in garages, monuments to short-term thinking. But my panels, those ugly additions that Kate had tried so hard to remove, hummed quietly on my roof, converting sunlight into survival. On day 19, the power came back. It happened at 3 in the morning. A sudden flood of light and sound that woke the entire neighborhood. People poured out of their houses, cheering, crying, hugging each other in the street. The crisis was over, but something had fundamentally changed. 3 weeks after the grid came back online, the HOA held a meeting to revise the community covenants. Kate was there, no longer as president, but as a resident. So was I, along with nearly every household. The board voted unanimously to not only allow solar panels, but to actively encourage them. They established a grant program to help families install backup power systems. They created community supply caches. They developed emergency response protocols. The panels on my roof, the ones that had almost cost me my home, became the blueprint for a new kind of neighborhood, one that valued resilience over appearance, preparedness over perfection. Margaret Chen installed panels 6 months later. So did the Ramirez family, and Tom Bradshaw and a dozen others. Within a year, our street looked less like a sterile suburban showcase and more like a community that understood the fragility of the systems we depend on. Kate and I never became close friends, but we developed a mutual respect. She'd learned what I'd known all along, that the things we mock and resist are often the things that save us. That pride is a luxury we can't afford when the lights go out. That true leadership isn't about control, it's about service. And sometimes the greatest act of strength isn't winning, it's admitting you were wrong and asking for help from the person you hurt. I still live in that house. The panels are still on my roof, more of them now. My battery bank has tripled in size, and when the power flickers, even for a second, I see my neighbors glance at my house and smile, knowing that if it happens again, we'll be ready. Not because we're paranoid, but because we learned that hope without preparation is just wishful thinking, and in a world that's growing more uncertain every day, the prudent choice isn't the popular one. It's the one that keeps you alive when everything else fails. The community isn't about matching mailboxes and manicured lawns. It's about being there when the lights go out and making sure everyone has a chance to see the sunrise. If this story moved you, or if you've ever been dismissed for trying to prepare for the worst, I want to hear from you. Leave a comment about what moment hit you the hardest. Subscribe to this channel for more stories that challenge the way we think about preparedness, community, and resilience. Like this video and share it with someone who needs to understand that being different isn't being difficult. Sometimes it's being wise. Because in the end, the things that make us stand out might be the very things that save us all.